So let's pick up where we left off, because you heard the line, and I'm gonna say it again because I want you guys to understand how deep this myth goes. Republicans freed the slaves. Democrats were the racists. But here's the thing: history isn't frozen in time. Political parties are not fixed ideologies. They're coalitions, strategies, and movements, and they evolve. And in this segment, we're going to walk through the real story of the party switch, piece by piece, decade by decade. Because no, it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like Republicans woke up racist in 1964. It was a slow, strategic, and deliberate. Let's go all the way back. Let's start with the 1930s and the 40s, the New Deal realignment. The roots of the realignment start with the Great Depression. The economy collapses. Hoover, a Republican, does basically nothing. And into the vacuum steps in Franklin D. Roosevelt with the New Deal. Now, here's the kicker. The New Deal wasn't racially progressive. A lot of its programs excluded black Americans, especially in the South. It was agricultural workers and domestic workers where most black folks were employed, left out of Social Security. The FHA redlined black neighborhoods and blocked access to mortgages. But still, FDR talked about lifting up the poor. He spoke to working class struggle in a way that transcended race, at least rhetorically. And for many black voters, that was the first time the federal government felt like it was listening. Black Americans who had been loyal to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln for generations, you can't blame them because, slavery was abolished under the Republican Party. They were loyal. Of course they were. I don't blame them. But they started to switch at that time. Between 1932 and 1944, support for the Democratic Party among black voters rose from less than 25% to over 70%. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even just. But FDR gave a glimpse of government that could work for the people. And that began the slow departure of black voters from the GOP. Now, let's start with the second part, Truman's military desegregation, 1948. Fast forward, 1948, President Harry Truman, a Democrat, uses Executive Order 9981, desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, that was bold, and it pissed off Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats. The same year, Strom Thurmond, he led a revolt, forming the States' Rights Democratic Party, running on a platform of racial segregation and white supremacy. Quote from Strom at that time, and I quote, "There's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the N-war race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches." Yeah, that's who they were. Now, what happened next is key. The Democratic Party began to fracture, split between the Northern Labor Progressive wing and its Southern Segregationist wing. But here's what matters. Truman won. And that sent a signal, slow but clear, that Democratic Party was moving inch by inch toward racial progress. Let's go back. Now let's go with part 3. Civil rights and the shattering of the South, the 1950s and 60s. Now, we get to the big one, the Civil Rights era. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. The Little Rock Nine in 1957. The March on Washington in 1963. Don't forget Selma. That's still very important, the most important. This movement wasn't just a moral reckoning. It was a political earthquake. And here's where President Lyndon B. Johnson comes in. LBJ wasn't some radical. He was a Southern Democrat himself. But when JFK was assassinated, LBJ stepped in, and he knew the time had come. He signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And when he signs them, he reportedly turns to his staff and says, "We have lost the South for a generation." And that wasn't just poetic. That was prophetic. I mean, the South is still super Republican. Because what happened next? A white Southern revolt. That year, Barry Goldwater, Republican nominee for president, voted against the Civil Rights Act. He said it. What he said it was about states' rights. The same phrase segregationists had used for 100 years. In the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, Louisiana, all flipped red for the first time in modern history. Let's go to part 4. The Southern strategy begins, 68 to the 80s. Now, let's enter to this. The GOP's master plan to pick up the pieces of white Southern backlash and build a new Republican base around racial resentment. Richard Nixon runs in 1968. His campaign is a masterclass in coded racism. He talks about law and order in the middle of civil rights protests, the silent majority, white Americans fed up with racial justice, states' rights. Again, we know what that means. And it works. Nixon wins the presidency and starts peeling southern states away from the Democrats permanently. But the real mission comes from Lee Atwater, and I already told you about that, the strategist advisor for both Reagan and Bush in 1981, and how the now infamous interview that he said that the N-word, all that stuff. Now, here's the next part of the quote that I haven't told you. Here's the second half of that quote. You're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes and all these things, but the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. That's the blueprint. They didn't abandon racism. They made it subtle, respectable, allegedly. And they weaponized it in elections from the 70s through the 80s into today. You don't agree with me or with that? What did Trump say in 2016 about anybody who's Hispanic? They're racist, they're rapists, drug dealers. I mean, come on. And now, let's go to part 5. The Reagan to Trump, the new Republican identity. With Nixon's groundwork laid Ronald Reagan, and he took it to the next level. He launched his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Funny. The town where civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner were murdered by the Klan in 1964. Her first speech about states' rights. And then came the war on welfare. The myth of the welfare queen, the gutting of public housing and schools, the prison industrial boom, all cloaked in colorblind language. And all while the Republican base, now made up of millions of white, Southern, and evangelical voters, hardened its identity around opposition to the very racial progress they used to brag about supporting. By the time we hit Trump, there's no more subtext. It's not dog whistles. It's blaring air horns. They say shithole countries, very fine people on both sides, birtherism, Muslim bans, voter suppression laws targeting black districts, defending Confederate statues, attacking DEI, calling black cities corrupt and un-American, trying to get people who don't agree with him, mainly minorities, to take away citizenship, kidnapping anybody who looks slightly brown and taking them to a gulag or a concentration camp in Florida. And we're seeing that books, and then we'll see in this today too, books about black history being banned, DEI offices being shut down, AP African American Studies stripped from curriculums, GOP officials openly defending January 6 insurrectionists who waved Confederate flags inside the Capitol, and defending a rapist. So, if you're still clinging to the Lincoln free the slaves, I gotta ask you, what year are you living in? Because this party today, this GOP, they don't just ignore racial justice. They run on resentment of it. So what does this switch mean? Why the lie? Why they lie about it? Why do they lie? Why do the right-wing pundits keep yelling about the KKK and Lincoln like it's a debate team trophy? Because they know. They know their policies today. The bans, the voter roll purges, the race baiting ads, they're indefensible. They know the moral high ground is gone. So they retreat into history, into this comforting fiction where they're still the good guys. They're a bunch of cowards dressed up as patriots. And let's be clear. Yes, the Democratic Party was once the party of slavery. Yes, the Republican Party once supported civil rights. But those are facts of history, not truths of identity. They don't erase the decades of work that people, black organizers, labor leaders, immigrants, and women did to change both parties. And this is not about making saints out of Democrats or demons out of Republicans. This is about the truth, because if you lie about the past, you'll justify injustice in the present. The party of Lincoln is dead, and the people pretending otherwise are counting on you to not notice. But again, in this show, we are wide awake, or as you like to say, you're just a bunch of wokes.